The death of Muammar Gaddafi on October 20, 2011, marked one of the most violent and controversial endings to the life of any modern dictator. The brutal circumstances surrounding his final hours reveal the savage nature of Libya's civil war and expose the dark underbelly of revolutionary justice gone wrong. The rise of a dictator. To understand the brutality of Gaddafi's final moments, one must first comprehend the depths of tyranny from which Libya was emerging. Born in a Bedouin tent in the desert near Sirte in 1942, Muammar Gaddafi rose from humble beginnings to become one of Africa's most feared dictators. On September 1, 1969, at just 27 years old, he led a bloodless military coup that overthrew the Western allied King Idris while the monarch was abroad, receiving medical treatment in Turkey. What began as a promising Arab nationalist revolution quickly devolved into 4 decades of brutal repression. Gaddafi established a totalitarian system disguised as direct democracy through his Green Book philosophy. But in reality, he maintained absolute control through a network of intelligence services, revolutionary committees, and state terror. The regime systematically eliminated political opposition, with thousands of dissidents disappearing into Libya's notorious prisons, where torture was routine. Under Gaddafi's rule, human rights violations became institutionalized. Political prisoners were subjected to horrific torture methods, including electric shocks, beatings with cables, and psychological abuse. The regime's security apparatus infiltrated every aspect of Libyan society, creating a climate of fear where citizens could be arrested for the slightest criticism of the government. Mass executions of political prisoners were common, with public hangings broadcast on state television to terrorize the population. The Arab Spring reaches Libya. The winds of change that swept across the Arab world in early 2011 finally reached Libya on February 15, 2011, when protests erupted in Benghazi, following the arrest of human rights lawyer Fatih Terbil. What started as demonstrations quickly escalated into a full-scale uprising when Gaddafi's security forces opened fire on peaceful protesters, killing dozens. The regime's violent response only fueled greater resistance across the country. By February 17th, declared as a day of rage, widespread protests had erupted across Libya, marking the official beginning of the Libyan civil war. Gaddafi's response was characteristically brutal and uncompromising. In a televised speech, he vowed to hunt down rebels inch by inch, room by room, promising to cleanse Libya house by house and show no mercy to the protesters he branded as rats and cockroaches. His forces used helicopter gunships, artillery, and snipers against civilian protesters, actions that would later result in war crimes charges from the International Criminal Court. The regime's crackdown was particularly savage in cities like Misrata, which endured a devastating siege lasting several months. Gaddafi's forces subjected the city to indiscriminate shelling with Grad rockets, mortars, and even cluster munitions banned under international law. Hospitals, schools, and residential areas were deliberately targeted in what amounted to collective punishment of the civilian population. The psychological warfare extended to cutting off food, water, and medical supplies, creating a humanitarian catastrophe that would later fuel the desire for revenge among Misrata's defenders. The NATO intervention as Gaddafi's forces advanced on Benghazi in March 2011, threatening to massacre the civilian population, the international community intervened. On March 17th, the UN Security Council authorized a no-fly zone to protect civilians, and NATO began Operation Unified Protector on March 19th. What was initially presented as a humanitarian intervention to protect civilians gradually evolved into active support for regime change, with NATO conducting over 26,000 sorties and 9,600 strike missions over 7 months. The intervention proved decisive in preventing Gaddafi from crushing the rebellion, but it also prolonged the conflict and contributed to Libya's eventual fragmentation. As NATO airstrikes degraded the regime's military capabilities, anti-Gaddafi forces gradually gained ground, eventually capturing Tripoli in August 2011. However, Gaddafi and his loyalists retreated to his hometown of Sirte, where they would make their final stand. The siege and isolation by October 2011, Sirte had become the last major stronghold of pro-Gaddafi forces. The city was completely surrounded by anti-government militias, primarily fighters from Misrata, who were determined to exact revenge for the months of siege their city had endured. The battle for Sirte was particularly brutal, with both sides showing little mercy as the conflict evolved into street-to-street fighting among the ruins of what had once been Gaddafi's showcase city. For Gaddafi personally, these final weeks represented a dramatic fall from power. The man who had once commanded absolute authority over Libya was now reduced to hiding in abandoned buildings, moving between safe houses every few days to avoid capture. His communications with the outside world had been severed, leaving him increasingly isolated and desperate as the noose tightened around his remaining territory. Former bodyguards and government officials later described how the once imperious dictator had become paranoid and erratic. Aware that his reign was coming to an end, the escape attempter's dawn broke on October 20, 2011. District 2 of Sirte, Gaddafi's hometown, had become a death trap. The once mighty leader who had ruled Libya with an iron fist for 42 years was now reduced to hiding in abandoned houses, scrounging for food and moving between safe houses every few days. His communications with the outside world had been severed, leaving him isolated and increasingly desperate. Around 8:30 a.m. local time, Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator's son who commanded the loyalist defense of Sirte, made the fateful decision to organize a massive breakout attempt. The convoy consisted of approximately 75 heavily armed vehicles carrying around 250 people, including Muammar Gaddafi, his inner circle, wounded fighters, and some remaining civilians. The delay in departure, originally planned for 3:30 a.m. but pushed back to 8 a.m., would prove catastrophic, as it gave NATO forces and rebel militias time to prepare their response. The convoy represented the last desperate gambit of a dying regime. Intelligence reports later revealed that Gaddafi had planned to escape to a loyalist stronghold in the south, possibly to regroup and continue resistance or to flee the country entirely. But the dictator's movements had been tracked for days through intercepted satellite phone communications, and NATO surveillance had the convoy under constant observation. The NATO strike. The convoy's movement was immediately detected by NATO surveillance. A Royal Air Force reconnaissance mission spotted the fast-moving vehicles, and NATO forces had intercepted a satellite phone call made by Gaddafi just days earlier. The response was swift and devastating. An American Predator drone, controlled remotely from a base near Las Vegas, fired the first missiles at the convoy approximately 3 kilometers west of Sirte. French Air Force Mirage 2000D fighter jets followed with additional strikes, using airburst GBU-12 500-pound bombs that sprayed the vehicles with deadly shrapnel. The NATO bombing was ruthlessly effective. Within minutes, 21 vehicles were destroyed or damaged, killing dozens of loyalist fighters and incinerating many beyond recognition. The convoy split into several groups, with some survivors attempting to continue their escape, while others were killed in the devastating secondary explosions of munitions loaded onto their vehicles. The airstrike transformed what had been an organized military formation into a scene of utter chaos, with burning vehicles scattered across the desert landscape and survivors desperately seeking cover. The hunt in the drainage pipes after. The airstrike destroyed the vehicle directly in front of Gaddafi's car. The dictator and his remaining companions, including his son Muammar, former defense minister Abu Bakr Yunus Jabr, and security chief Mansour Dow, took shelter in a nearby abandoned villa compound. But their refuge was short-lived, as Misrata-based militia forces began shelling the building with anti-aircraft guns and mortars. Faced with certain death if they remained, Gaddafi's group made a desperate dash across an open field toward 2 large drainage pipes underneath the main road. The once powerful leader, now wearing a helmet and bulletproof vest and carrying an automatic weapon, crawled through the concrete pipes with his bodyguards and inner circle. The image of the former brother leader, reduced to hiding in a sewer pipe, became one of the most symbolic moments of his downfall. But their hiding place was quickly discovered by the advancing Misrata fighters, who had surrounded the area and were systematically searching every possible hiding spot. In a final act of desperation, one of Gaddafi's bodyguards threw a hand grenade at the approaching militiamen. The grenade bounced off the concrete wall above the drainage pipe and exploded in the midst of Gaddafi's group, killing Defense Minister Abu Bakr Yunus instantly and spraying shrapnel that wounded Gaddafi in the left temple. The guard who threw the grenade lost part of his arm in the explosion and died at the scene. The capture and torture, what happened next, was captured on RAW. Unedited cell phone footage that documented 3 minutes and 38 seconds of pure brutality. Misrata militia fighters immediately descended from the road and seized the bleeding, wounded dictator. Blood was already gushing from the shrapnel wound in his head when the militiamen began their savage assault. The footage shows Gaddafi being dragged from the drainage pipe, dazed and bleeding profusely. As he was led onto the main road, a militiaman stabbed him in the buttocks with what appears to have been a bayonet, causing another rapidly bleeding wound. The Misrata fighters surrounded their captive, punching and beating him while screaming Allahu Akbar and Misrata repeatedly. The brutality was both systematic and chaotic. Witnesses described the scene as complete mayhem, with dozens of fighters competing to inflict violence on the captured dictator. Khalid Ahmed Raid, commander of the Eastern Coast Militia Brigade, later admitted to Human Rights Watch that the situation was a mess and acknowledged that they couldn't control everyone. Gaddafi was pulled by his hair, beaten repeatedly, and at one point placed on the front of a pickup truck that tried to drive him away, only for him to fall off due to the violent treatment. The abuse was both physical and psychological. In video footage, Gaddafi can be heard saying, "God forbids this," and asking his captors, "Do you know right from wrong?" as they continued their brutal assault. The man who had once threatened to hunt down his enemies, inch by inch, room by room, was now at the complete mercy of fighters whose city his forces had besieged and shelled for months. The reversal of fortune was complete and devastating. The final moments, the exact moment of Gaddafi's death, remains shrouded in conflicting accounts, but the evidence suggests he died from the combination of his wounds and the brutal beating rather than in any crossfire. Phone video footage taken at the scene appears to show his nearly naked and apparently lifeless body being loaded into an ambulance, suggesting he may have already died by the time he left the area of his capture. Some militia fighters claimed he was shot in the head during a dispute between different rebel groups about where to take him, while official sources initially claimed he died from bullet wounds sustained in crossfire. However, Human Rights Watch investigation concluded that the evidence strongly suggests Gaddafi was killed after his capture, which would constitute a war crime. The chaotic nature of his final moments reflected the broader breakdown of law and order that had consumed Libya during the civil war. By the time the ambulance reached Misrata after a journey of at least 2 hours, Gaddafi was almost certainly dead. His body was then displayed to the public, with images of the deceased dictator quickly circulating around the world, providing graphic evidence of his violent end. The public display of his corpse, while satisfying to many Libyans who had suffered under his rule, violated international standards for the treatment of the dead and further highlighted the absence of rule of law in post-revolutionary Libya. The broader massacre Gaddafi's death was just part of a larger massacre that unfolded that day. Human Rights Watch investigation revealed that Misrata-based militias executed at least 66 captured members of the Gaddafi convoy after bringing them under their control. Amateur video footage shows 29 detained persons being beaten, slapped, insulted, and spat upon by their captors. 6 of the 29 people shown being abused in the video were later found dead at the nearby Mahari Hotel, along with dozens of other executed prisoners. Hospital staff in Sirte confirmed matches between additional men seen in the videos and bodies found at the hotel. These killings represented the largest documented execution of detainees committed by anti-Gaddafi forces during the 8-month conflict. At the scene of the final battle, Human Rights Watch researchers found evidence of additional summary executions. Video footage captured a young man with his leg in a cast, sitting behind Gaddafi during his capture, appearing unharmed with his hands raised in surrender. Moments later, after bursts of machine gun fire, the same man was shown lying lifeless among the bodies of other dead loyalists, with blood still flowing from fresh wounds. The systematic nature of these executions suggested they were not the result of combat, but rather deliberate killings of prisoners. The son's fate, Muammar Gaddafi, who had led the doomed convoy and commanded Sirte's defense, met an equally brutal end. Video footage taken shortly after his capture shows him conscious and able to walk, despite small shrapnel wounds in his upper chest. Later footage shows him in a room with Misrata fighters, drinking water and smoking cigarettes, appearing relatively unharmed. By the afternoon of October 20th, he was dead, with new major wounds suggesting he was killed in custody. The killing of Muammar, like that of his father, appeared to be a summary execution rather than a combat death. The transformation of the once powerful son from captured prisoner to corpse within hours demonstrated the complete breakdown of any pretense of due process or respect for international humanitarian law. His death eliminated one of the last potential rallying points for Gaddafi loyalists and ensured that the old regime's bloodline would not continue to threaten Libya's new order. The aftermath and cover-up, the bodies of Muammar Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi, and Abu Bakr Yunus were ultimately buried in a secret, unmarked desert location to prevent their burial place from becoming a rallying point for former loyalists. The decision to deny them proper burial rites further violated Islamic traditions and international standards, but reflected the deep fear that any memorial site could become a focal point for counter-revolution. The Libyan transitional authorities promised a full investigation into the circumstances of Gaddafi's death, but no official inquest was ever conducted. 7 months after the killings, Libyan authorities had neither investigated nor held accountable those who committed these crimes. The failure to pursue justice highlighted the transitional government's lack of control over the heavily armed militias that had emerged during the civil war. International human rights organizations condemned the killings as violations of international law. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch called for an independent autopsy and investigation into how Gaddafi died. The International Criminal Court was urged to examine the crimes and consider whether they fell within its jurisdiction. However, the chaotic state of post-revolutionary Libya made any meaningful investigation virtually impossible. Historical context and legacy, the brutal circumstances of Gaddafi's death, reflected the savage nature of Libya's 2011 civil war, during which both sides committed serious human rights violations. Pro-Gaddafi forces had subjected Misrata to a devastating 2-month siege, using indiscriminate shelling and cluster munitions that killed hundreds of civilians. The revenge exacted by Misrata fighters on October 20th was a direct response to the suffering their city had endured, but it also demonstrated how cycles of violence and retribution could consume even a revolution that had begun with hopes for democracy and human rights. The dictator who had once proclaimed he would die as a martyr in Libya met his end not in a glorious final battle, but cowering in a drainage pipe, beaten and humiliated by fighters whose city he had tried to destroy. His death marked the effective end of NATO's Operation Unified Protector and the collapse of the Gaddafi regime that had ruled Libya for over 4 decades. Yet the manner of his killing also presaged the lawlessness and militia rule that would plague Libya for years to come. The graphic footage and photographs of Gaddafi's final moments became some of the most widely circulated images of the Arab Spring, serving as both a symbol of the dictator's downfall and a disturbing reminder of the brutal realities of revolutionary justice. The failure to properly investigate these war crimes would later contribute to Libya's descent into chaos and ongoing instability, as the same militias that killed Gaddafi continued to operate with impunity in the post-revolutionary period. The last hours of Muammar Gaddafi revealed the transformation of a man who had once wielded absolute power into a desperate, wounded fugitive meeting a violent end at the hands of those he had oppressed. His death, while marking the end of his tyrannical rule, also demonstrated how the cycle of violence and revenge could consume even a revolution that had begun with hopes for democracy and human rights. The brutal legacy of October 20th, 2011 continues to haunt Libya more than a decade later, serving as a grim reminder that the manner in which dictatorships end can shape the character of what follows.